All right, welcome to the Goldsmith Talk Lectures. I'm Patrick Omachowski. I'm here with Deborah Berke, who's visiting from Yale. So Kirsten, the girl that usually is doing the interview, she usually leads off with a question that is, what brings you unexpected joy in architecture?
In architecture, I would much rather answer that question about life. What brings me unexpected joy in life is swimming in the ocean. What brings me unexpected joy in architecture is seeing light hit a building in a way I didn't anticipate it was going to. So whether they're unique shadows, or it makes a material sparkle, or behave unexpectedly in a positive way, that's what I like, sunshine on a building.
So I got your book the other day. I was looking through it, and I think you had something called Any Material Can Seduce. Is that correct?
Right.
So that kind of reminds me of that. So how does that happen? Do you experiment, or is it just trial and error?
I think what it is I do believe any material can seduce, and it's interesting that we're seated here in front of in this material library, because I think for some materials, seduction comes through repetition. You know, a brick isn't so interesting, but a beautifully laid brick wall is an incredible thing to look at. I think another way that materials can seduce is if they're used in unexpected ways. So, you know, a naked light bulb is not so exciting, but when you're in a pristine room and there's a lineup of naked light bulbs and somebody's really cared about them, you think, light bulbs, I'm seeing them in a new way. So I think it's really about application and detailing that makes a material seductive.
Do you find yourself, when a project's in the process of being built, going in and hashing out those details, or is that something that you try to set all down before?
Set it all down before. Yeah, we have a huge material library in my office, not unlike this, but much more densely packed, and it's 100 feet long of shelves full of materials. I think one of the reasons I really believe this, any material can seduce position, or why I take that position, is because I think people, particularly lay people, think that fancy is somehow better than not fancy. You know, that silver is better than aluminum, or when I'm really rich, I'm going to have gold faucets, but in fact, stainless steel faucets are glorious, right? So it's really about thinking, how do we as architects put materials together in such a way that they don't have to be expensive to be beautiful?
That reminds me, I was looking at some of your work, and the bank you did, and where is it?
In Columbus, Indiana.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of that. Is that kind of in line with what you're saying right now?
It's exactly in line, and thank you for noticing and liking that building. One thing, it's a tiny little building in a sea of giant, sort of strip shopping center kind of buildings, Lowe's and stuff, and it's a tiny little building. And on the inside, one of the most beautiful walls is just a wall of safe deposit boxes, which are a distorted grid of different sized squares, all polished stainless steel, simple, beautiful. And then on the outside is, the channel glass and the volume across the top. Same idea, like a pretty basic material, but used in an unexpected way.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when you kind of going on with some of the frameworks you set up in your book, which I liked, would that project be were you the tailor or the distiller then? Or I really liked that kind of way of thinking about our role as a tailor or as a distiller, and how you see yourself in these different projects and inhabiting those different roles.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. It's funny. I think that was more of a tailor, although I like all of those descriptions, because we were custom crafting this building, sort of making it fit exactly right for its actually very ordinary program, right? It's a neighborhood bank where the drive-through is probably more important than going inside.
Up, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think the act of being a distiller is equally important, where you just take the most critical parts you need and let the rest of it get burned off, like editing out all the parts you don't need so you can do as much as possible with as little as possible. That's, I guess, what I mean by distilling. So, yeah, I like those metaphors for architects.
Yeah, I do too. So I was looking at, since you are at another school, and I was looking at your the letter from you to Yale, and you quote Vitruvius, which I really enjoy. And I also found another quote when you say the students should make up their own minds after hearing the positions and philosophies of many. Can you kind of talk about how you bring one, like of course, your own point of view into your pedagogy and leading a school, and then also how you make sure to encompass more than just one narrative?
Well, I think Yale, that's part of Yale's tradition. I mean, it's one that I'm really sympathetic to. Beyond sympathetic to, it's one I really believe in and hope to carry forward, which is that our job as educators of architects is to make you or the architecture student be their own best architect they could possibly be, which means in part being as good a critic of their own work as they can possibly be. And I think that's a very different philosophy than saying, copy me as a way to learn something. Is more, I'm going to work with you to teach you how to be critical of your own work. So the Yale model, particularly in the advanced studios, is we could have Frank Gehry teaching and also Leon Creer teaching. Now those are old men at this point, but that idea of representing not just different styles, but actually really different ways of thinking about architecture. Or we might have somebody whose primary outlook is the environment, sustainability, and resiliency, and somebody else whose primary interest and outlook is, weaving together destroyed parts of cities after highways get removed or something like that. So the students can pick from what's being offered to help them shape their own education. I think that works at graduate school, obviously.
And then how do you, does he also kind of notice you use, interdisciplinary approach, is that, how do you really provide that at a graduate level, right? When you are kind of being taught to focus in on a specific craft. So how do you, because I agree, right? We need to be drawing by the disciplines, but how do you do it at a professional degree kind of capacity?
I think that's a really good question. How do you do that? Because of course, at a professional degree, you have all these required courses, and you have to go down this checklist of things you have to learn. And I think the being exposed to different disciplines and talking to people in other disciplines and working with them is not so that you can become a painter or a dancer or a chemist or a physicist. It's that you can talk to them and they can talk to you, and you can help inform each other's creative and scholarly process. So at a place like Yale, or I'm sure at a place like UT, right, good universities where people want to be in conversation, it's about making those conversations possible. Some of it's about course offerings, some of it's about just creating an environment where there's a lunchtime event or a place to get a coffee, or when you have a jury, don't just have other architects, have somebody from a different discipline there to talk about it. We did a really interesting studio at Yale last semester, which was a building at a university for the deaf, and we had sign language people come and talk to the students about what it means to communicate through American Sign Language, and suddenly the architects were thinking about other criteria for making space than just the standard criteria. So I think bringing it into the educational dialogue is the most important part.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Also notice the use of the word kind of art and have, to stimulate artistic sensitivity and creative powers as one of the objectives of the school. Where do you see the role of art versus architecture? Are we in two different camps? Is it what is your take on this kind of? I know you just were with David, and he has a strong opinion about this, and I was wondering because art, when I look at Yale and people come out and the work there, it does have this kind of artistic, I would say maybe endeavor or embodiment in it, and I was wondering what your position is kind of on that.
So that's a great question, because I went to art school as an undergraduate. I mean, I studied architecture at RISD, but at RISD you're surrounded by artists, and in fact, I think on many campuses the architects are often the most creative people on campus, and the people in other majors are like, wow, you guys are nuts, or you stay up all night, or whatever. But at art school, architects tend to be some of the more cautious people on campus, and you have painters and filmmakers and illustrators and sculptors and whatever else everybody else is doing, and they're kind of pulling the architects, push yourself a little harder, or try something a little crazy, or have you ever looked at this upside down, or whatever it might be. So I do think interaction and discussion between artists and architects is really valuable and important, and it pushes architects' creativity. At Yale, architecture is thought of as one of the 4 art schools on campus. So there's art, architecture, music, and drama. And there's some dialogue, but there's also a lot of internal focus. The people in the drama school are writing plays and producing them, and the people in the architecture school are studying structures and environmental systems. There's not a lot of time for overlap, but it's a kind of the mindset of the place. If anything, I think in the 21st century, architecture has to hang on to its connection to the arts, but not be so seduced by it that it forgets that it has an enormous responsibility to the world in terms of climate change, housing, consumption of materials. I think architecture has to be really responsible, and part of that process is engaging the sciences, particularly those that have to do with climate change. So I see architecture as sort of at the middle of a big Venn diagram that includes the arts and the sciences as what it is, what makes it up.
And so does, when we are relating to art, are we trying, is it more of an idea of how we can think about representing what we're doing, or are you really conceptual pushes that we can use from the art world? I'm kind of wondering. For me, it's more conceptual pushes and challenges. I think how we represent architecture, it's important, but it's a pretty straightforward personal investigation that people can enjoy and have a good time with. But I don't think you need to learn from a painter how to show a building. It doesn't hurt to talk about it, but that's not the most critical outcome of a conversation with a painter. So I know you did a gallery in New York.
Yeah.
So when you're doing that and creating that space, did you, was it, what was the role of the artist or the representation of art in that project?
That's an interesting question that you asked, because we met with a number of the artists that gallerist represents to talk to them. Mm-hmm. But in the end, the real critical force in that process was the gallerist, the woman who owned the gallery, saying, here's how I would like the visitors to my gallery to see art. Where's the opportunity to see it from far away? Where's the opportunity to come upon it as you turn a corner? Where do I want the light to come from? So she had really strong feelings about what the layperson's experience of seeing art should be like, that we listened to, which was a good balance to also listening to the artists who maybe they were only thinking about their own work, where she was thinking about every artist's work.
It kind of, this makes sense, but the jump to then, you think about a development, right? You have...
Yeah, I've done some of that work.
Right. Yeah, so you have a developer who is, obviously money's involved,
right.
But you also are trying to think about that, right? The average person that might live there. And do you, in that similar case, do you value, does a developer ever provide special insight, or...
Often not. But I think a good developer, and there is such a thing, right? I think a good developer, one who cares enough to hire a good architect as opposed to just hire somebody to get the drawings done so that they can get their permit and make their money faster. I think a good developer who cares about architecture will value what the architect has to say. So if the developer's cram in another apartment or make that room smaller, and the architect says, but it's really important that the window be this big and fill the room with light, or that the kitchen be oriented this way, I think you actually can have a meaningful conversation with an enlightened developer, because they recognize that good design actually sells.
So do you find yourself, I know you use the word enlightened developer, when you are trying to enlighten or educate or edify, right, into that, do you use architectural ways of speaking, or do you use more ways of speaking like you kind of do in the book, where you're kind of more describing the essentials of a home, or I don't know, how do you frame or how do you convince the developer?
My own strategy as an architect is to speak to lay people in language they understand and try for architecture to be inclusive, because everybody's life is impacted by the built environment, unless you're living in a cave. So I think using language that people can understand so that they feel part of the built world is much more important than using fancy, complicated language that keeps people out. Everybody should have an architectural vocabulary, right?
Yeah, no, and that's what I really love about this. I mean,
this book is funny, right?
You're very, I think at least my interpretation, that you're very careful with the words that you're using and the discourse that you're creating to talk about a home, and I think it's accessible from many levels, and I really appreciated that, and I think it's a really great perspective.
Thank you.
Take.
Yeah. All right, now we're done, right?
Now we're done, yeah.